Welcome and thank you for joining this month's webinar, Transforming Policies to Build Strong Local Economies, to introduce Eric Griego. Eric is the principal and founder of Fast Forward Strategic Consulting. We are also extremely honored to have Eric as one of our fellows in the 2014 cohort. All right, Eric, take it away.
Thank you so much, Leslie, and thank you all for joining us. I'm really honored to be part of this session today. It's near and dear to my heart as a recovering local and state elected official who tried to figure out how to learn from some of the folks we're going to hear from today about how to affect policy that's going to be much more conducive to promoting a localist economy and to foster alternative and local economic development policy. So I want to introduce our two great speakers today, and I think they're gonna sort of give us some things to think about for sure. First, Stacy Mitchell, who's with the Institute for Local Self Reliance, ILSR, for those of you who are in the know, and Stacy's the co-director for the Institute for Local Self Reliance and directs its community-scaled economy initiative, which produces research and analysis and partners with a range of allies to design and implement policies that curb economic consolidation and strengthen community-rooted enterprise. Much of her work has focused on two pivotal sectors of the economy, retail and banking, and among the first she was among the first to raise the alarm about the rise of the mega retailers in the 1990s. Stacy is a nationally recognized leader in the movement to counter their power, and she's going to be talking about ILSR's new agenda, which is the national conversation. And we also have a great local perspective from Austin, Texas. Rebecca, and she was helping with pronunciation before this, so Rebecca's going to probably correct me, but Rebecca Melançon.
That's very good. Very good.
All right. It's better than I was thinking I was going to do. So she's with the Austin Independent Business Alliance and the Local First Policy Committee. Rebecca was a founding member of the nonprofit Austin Independent Business Alliance, AIBA, and served as vice president from 2002 until 2009 when she joined the staff of AIBA as executive director in March 2010. As a strong advocate for local business, she served on Austin's Comprehensive Plan Task Force, the Travis County Economic Development Subcommittee, and hosts a local business conference in Austin. She's a member of the Local First Policy Committee that worked with ISLR to craft the policy platform previewed in this webinar, which you're going to hear about in a second. So I want to turn it over to them, and just as Leslie said, we'll have lots of opportunities for discussion on both local and state and national policy questions around localist policy. And we hope that many of you will be able to weigh in on that conversation. But let me first turn it over to Stacy.
Thanks so much, Eric. I appreciate the introduction, and it's really great to be here with you all, and thanks to Leslie and to BALLE for organizing what I think is going to be really useful and hopefully helpful conversation here today. The Institute for Local Self Reliance is a 41-year-old national nonprofit organization. We got started in 1974, so we're really early pioneers of the localism movement. Leslie, I don't know if you want to go to the next slide. Just a few pictures of us from back in the day and over the years. So we really champion the notion of that there should be the widest distribution of ownership and local authority in the economy, and that this is really key to get into a more equitable and sustainable future. Do you have the next slide? So what we do is we produce research. Somebody once said that we put hard numbers to soft dreams. We do a lot of really great detailed research about the why and the what of getting to more sustainable and local economies. We produce tools for community groups and grassroots organizations to use in their own local communities to make change. We do a lot of policy research, and we develop new policy models, legislative models at the state, local, and federal level. And then we collaborate with a lot of partners to actually implement those models and experiment with change, really creating a kind of feedback loop to further refine them. And then next slide, please. So we organize our work into 6 program areas, which you can see here along the blue bar: banking, broadband, energy, independent business, the public good, and waste to wealth. These are sectors of the economy where we felt that there's real opportunities for change and for realizing the sort of vision that we have. If you click on any one of these sectors, and in the next slide, please, you'll go to a page that's really rich with in-depth reporting and analysis, stories about what's working, model legislation, and then lots of tools you can use to help communicate that information to your elected officials and other people in your community. And the next slide, please. And you can also, on each of the initiative pages, find, in each of these areas, find a sign-up box for our email newsletters. We publish several newsletters on the different program areas that ILSR focuses on. I think the Hometown Advantage might be the one that would be most relevant to this audience. And then the other thing I'll point out is that we have this rules library that contains over 300 model policies at all levels of government across these different areas of the economy, with supporting research and background information that you can use. And then the last slide, please. And Leslie suggested just to give you a flavor of what we do, to just talk a little bit about some of the things we've accomplished lately. So in the last year, we've had a big influence on the media discussion and public debate around some of these issues. We've had articles in national publications like the Wall Street Journal. That's me testifying at the Congressional Progressive Caucus about how to shift policy to support local economies. We've had some success this year in stopping giveaways for big business. So we did an op-ed in the Minneapolis Star-Tribune, for example, about a proposed multi-million-dollar public giveaway to Amazon to bring a warehouse into the Twin Cities, and that helped galvanize a bunch of local opposition, and that was ultimately blocked. We've done some really great reports this year. One that might be of interest is North Dakota. We did a report on the North Dakota pharmacy ownership law, which is a unique law in the U.S. that mandates that pharmacies be locally owned. And lo and behold, North Dakota has some of the lowest prescription drug prices and best pharmacy access and service of any state. So it's a really great case study of why local ownership matters. And then many of you may know us through the 2015 Independent Business Survey that we did this year. Surveyed over 3,000 businesses nationally and developed a lot of good data on what the challenges are and what the opportunities and benefits of these businesses are. And then lastly, we've published lately some good policy guides, including one on local procurement and how to use procurement strategies to support the local economy and create more inclusive opportunities as well. And we did one earlier this year on cooperative ownership of commercial real estate buildings as a tool for really anchoring economic development in the hands of neighbors. So that's a little bit of a flavor of what we do, and with that, I think I'm going to Rebecca.
I lost y'all for a minute. Okay, is it my turn now?
You're up, Rebecca.
Okay. I'm Rebecca Melançon. I'm the Executive Director of the Austin Independent Business Alliance. We are a 13-year-old nonprofit representing locally owned businesses. We currently represent over 800 locally owned businesses, and we're the second oldest independent business alliance in the country. So we've been at this a little bit of time, not as long as Stacy, but for a while. We offer our members lots of services. Some of them are typical of what you might see at a Chamber of Commerce, which technically we are. We're 501c6. A lot of networking opportunities, a lot of marketing. We do breakfast luncheons, mixers, and all kinds of events for our members. But we market several things. We market not just our members to the community and to consumers and to each other, or as we like to call it, we market H to H, human to human. But we also help to educate the public in Austin about the benefits of shopping locally, and we've participated in some of ISLR's studies and love the results. It's awesome to have that from a national perspective. But one of the important things that we do is advocacy for local business. And this is really, really crucial because all of the other things we do, businesses can do alone, they can do with each other, they can find other organizations to do them, they can certainly market themselves and network and do business-to-business deals and all kinds of things. The thing that we cannot do alone is advocacy. I started going in the City Hall and talking about some of the issues with local business when I had 50 members. And I got a certain ear, and that was important. But then when I walked in the door with 100 members and 300 members and 800 members, I get a whole different level of attention. And I'm really looking forward to the day when I can walk in the door with 1,000 members and 2,000 members and 5,000 members and say, here's what needs to be changed. In 2011, we wrote something called the Local Business Manifesto, which is on our website. Could you skip to the very last slide for this? I'm sorry, they're out of order of how I want to talk about the website a little bit. But it's at ibuyAustin.com. If you look under advocacy, you'll see some information about our Local Business Manifesto. We wrote it to bring attention to the issues of local business, to talk about how we in the city could work together in a better way to make a more thriving community here for local business. And it just absolutely took off. To my total surprise, it's been downloaded about 4,000 times across the country, and I get calls from a lot of economic development departments and other organizations on how we did this and can you use it? And my answer is yes, take any of it, use it in any way you can in your community, and glad that we could be of help in getting you kick-started. But one of the programs that we do that is specific to today's conversation is 2 years ago, we started something called the Local Business Conference. The City of Austin had done a summit, a small business summit, asking businesses what could the city do to improve. I don't think Austin is unique in not paying attention to their local businesses, so this will probably resonate across the country. But there were about 200 answers to that question. The program itself seemed fine at the beginning, but it stalled because the city didn't really do anything with all these suggestions. And that's when AIBA decided we need to pick up this ball and run with it. So that's when we started having the Local Business Conference. I kind of do support and grassroots work that really helps Stacy and helps on the national level, because we point blank ask. We now get about 70 local business owners, and we point blank ask them one question: what can the City of Austin do to make Austin a more thriving community for local business? And it is the 300 some odd answers to that one question that we then process through, and we work all year on specific goals to help achieve those goals. We do try and narrow it down, but we get the businesses to prioritize, and that's a huge difference than what our local government does. When our local government did this, they prioritized. The priorities of governmental departments is not the same as the priorities of the business owners. So we kind of go to the source, ask them what can be done. They come up with amazing ideas, some of which are achievable, some of which are not, but we then focus on a few and work to achieve those. And it's filtering those ideas up to Stacy's level and nationally from different people around the country. You start to see a connection that a lot of local businesses are all struggling with the same issues. We're very unique, we're very independent, but we're still struggling with the same things. So it's a thrill to be able to work with ISLR and look at what we can do on a national level for these kinds of issues.
Thanks, Rebecca. We want to hear a little more about the platform that ISLR has been working on and how it might play out in the communities across the country. So Stacy's going to take us through their most recent work on the 5 policy areas that they've been focusing on. So Stacy, over to you.
Thank you. So our contention at ILSR is that policy is really what gets this movement to scale. It's what will take it from the margins of the economy really to the mainstream. The nature of our economy, how it operates, the scale in which business operates, the values that run through it are really driven largely by public policy. There are all kinds of ways in which local, state, and federal policy influences the nature of our economy. And so if we want a different economy, one that's more equitable and inclusive and sustainable and more local, then we've got to change those structures that are really driving what the outcomes are. So our feeling, having been in this movement for a long time, is that we've done a lot of great work as a movement to elevate education and people's thought process, but that we're not going to make the kind of transformation that we need just through the sum of individual choices, the choices that we make as consumers or business owners or investors. We've really got reflect systems as our collective power to change those bigger policy issues. One of the sectors that I often cite to really brings this into stark relief is the food sector. On the one hand, we've had this just incredible growth over the last 10 years or so in local farms and local farmers markets and independent grocers, and local food of all kinds has just really taken off, and it's been this incredible thing. But today, it's still just a few percentage points of the overall food system. And in that same space of time, food has really, the whole food system in the U.S. has come to be dominated really by one company. If you could go to the next slide. And it's Walmart. Walmart now captures 1 out of every $4 that Americans spend on groceries, which gives it just enormous power to dictate how food is processed and grown all the way up the food chain. And there's a whole host of tax incentives, zoning policies, the Farm Bill, failure to enforce antitrust that have all conspired and supported Walmart's growth and power in this space. And so if we want to shift this dynamic, again, we've really got to go back to the underlying policy issues. Next slide, please. So the conventional wisdom, as I alluded to, is that big business has risen to the top because they they outcompete, they're better, it's just market forces delivering those outcomes. But really, we've done a lot of research that suggests that in reality, what's going on is that we have a rigged market. We have companies that are able to use their political power to win favors and to win legislation that gives them an advantage in the marketplace. And we really want to expose that that's going on. There are a lot of examples of this, and I won't go through them now, but as I said, we've done a lot of research really to support that. The next slide, please. So over the years, ILSR has been doing research on all kinds of pieces of public policy. We've done work on zoning and land use, we've done work on antitrust, we've done work on economic development incentives, and so on. And we now feel like we really have a fairly good bird's eye view of what these bigger policy structures are and what is an overall agenda for making this change. And we've distilled it down into a kind of 5 pillars because we wanted something that, was graspable, that you can have 5 things that people could name and it was easy to get a message out about, and then within each of those contain lots of detail down all through the three levels of government. So next slide. Those 5 points are stop subsidizing big destructive companies. As I mentioned, there are all kinds of ways in which we shift public dollars into their hands. There was a study that came out just a couple of weeks ago from Good Jobs First that looked at just 15 states and looked at their economic development spending, their incentives for economic development. They documented about $3.2 billion in incentives that have been given in the last few years, and 90% of those dollars went into the hands of big companies. So stopping those subsidies and redirecting how those public dollars are spent is a core part of this plan. The second is that we need to restore fair competition and open markets, which means we need to return to having a robust view of antitrust and of using antitrust to maintain and not allow big companies to exercise their market power in ways that undermine local businesses. There are lots of examples of this, but one that I think is very apparent is the fact that Visa and MasterCard have basically a monopoly over credit card processing, and right now are able to charge local business owners these huge fees every time a consumer swipes their credit card. There's a fee that local business has to pay. And for a lot of businesses, those fees that they pay every month are in the same order as the amount of money they're spending on rent. Because they have no other choice. They have to accept Visa and MasterCard. That's something that they don't allow in Europe. You know, they've really policed that and they've put regulations in place. And what we say is, gosh, if you took that power away from Visa and MasterCard and insisted on more reasonable fees, that's dollars that local businesses could put into paying their employees higher wages, for example. The third piece is ensuring that local entrepreneurs have the capital that they need. Access to capital is just a debilitating issue for a lot of people who want to start and grow businesses. In our survey this year, we found that of those businesses that had sought a loan in the last 2 years, 1 out of every 3 had been unable to get the loan that they needed, and among businesses owned by people of color, it was 1 out of every 2 unable to get the capital they need to grow. 4, we need to create a built environment that's conducive to local businesses. You know, the nature of our streets, the nature of our places has a lot of influence on what kind of economy we create and how well local entrepreneurs can set up shop and how well they do. And then lastly, we need to invest in sectors and communities that have been marginalized by the current economy. We need to make some targeted investments to regrow local economies in critical places. One way we can do that is looking at our procurement spending, for example. There are other great examples out there. I like the Pennsylvania's Fresh Food Financing Initiative, for example, is a state that has helped seed and fund nearly 100 independent grocery stores in low-income communities across both rural areas and urban areas in Pennsylvania. Those kinds of initiatives we need to do on a much wider scale. And then next slide, please. So the question that, you know, in developing this 5-point agenda, which as I mentioned has, within each of those 5 areas, has federal proposals, state proposals, local proposals, for many different, you know, specific policy initiatives. So the question is, how do we give this agenda legs? And we think that in addition to having the right analysis and a compelling prescription for how to do that, that we need to align the movement around the shared platform. We need to collaborate to make this more visible in the media and in public debate, and to identify in advance key pieces of that agenda. What are the particular policy proposals within that that we have an opportunity to try to move right now? And lastly, we need to build relationships with allies, groups working on economic justice, groups working on environmental sustainability, and so on across our states. Next slide, please. Next slide, please, if you can. Oh, maybe it's being a little slow. So I'll just keep on, but to help us figure out, to help ILSR figure out how to do that, earlier this year we convened a committee of local first leaders in about 10 cities or 10 regions of the country. These were groups that we know and had worked with, like Rebecca's organization, for a long time, and that we felt would be good partners to help us wrestle with this question of how do we move this agenda out into the world and how do we bring visibility to it. So we're really just getting started and thinking about this. The next slide, please. We've met a couple of times this year, and what we're focused on right now is developing this policy platform, the 5 pieces, and putting it together into a policy report that we're going to be releasing soon, and inviting other organizations to sign on to and to use in their communities and join up with us in trying to promote this. We're thinking about hosting a series of calls and webinars that would be on particular aspects of this agenda or on particular strategies around how we're going to roll it out and begin to talk to lawmakers and think about moving it. We want to think about whether there are opportunities to strategize around a few key issues. For example, are there, 2 or 3 things in the next year or so that we see an opportunity to try to introduce bills and legislation in multiple cities or multiple states? So maybe it's a bill to dramatically reduce all of those corporate subsidies and redirect those dollars in ways to benefit communities. Could we move something like that in a few different places and use our kind of collective experience of doing it to build the momentum around that idea? Could we look at places, states or cities that wanted to do some analysis about access to capital and look at ways that they can reform the banking system to free up more money for local businesses, those kinds of ideas. And then we also we're mindful of the 2016 election, and are there ways in which we can, bring this conversation into that space and into that debate. So I should just emphasize this is, as I said, we're at the beginning. It's a kind of an experimental and iterative process of sort of figuring out how to do this, but I really feel like this is the right time. And then just the last slide, please. If you're interested in following our release of this or getting involved, please do be in touch.
Thank you, Stacy. That's a great agenda, and so before we open it up to folks on the call, I want to ask Rebecca, given this policy agenda, how much of that are you working on in Austin, and which of those seem sort of ripe in terms of the local politics for the next phase of your local advocacy with your local government?
Well, some of those things are not really addressed at a local level, but more a state and federal level. But of course, they have ramifications down to the local level. And a lot of what we do is look at listening to our business owners and saying, what are the roadblocks for you? What do you need? And how can we enact policy change to do that? So it's not that our agendas are identical. But obviously, everything that we both do helps local business. What AIBA does helps it on a purely local level. What we do here in Austin helps businesses in Austin, but it also helps feed what Stacy does. And if we can go to, let's see, the 5th slide, if that's possible. 5th frame. In these 2 frames, and I hope we can get that up soon, but one of the ways that we work is we form from 15 or 20 of our business owners who attend the conference, we form a leadership circle. And the leadership circle agrees to meet monthly and to work on ideas on how to achieve the goals that the whole conference has set forth. So some of these ideas may be policy. Some of these ideas may be procedural. Some of them may be outlines that we can work with city staff on, and some of them require us to go through city council for, the larger things and resolutions and that sort of stuff. But we never give up on a goal until it's achieved or it's absolutely impossible. So if we can advance to the next slide. In 2013, these were the goals that our members told us they wanted. They wanted the city to hire a local business liaison who was at the director level. So this would put him on peer with the directors of other departments, and perhaps we could get more things done. Our permitting department was an absolute disaster, and it was improve the process of permitting. It's one of the few things that affects almost every business. Improve the approach and implementation of code enforcement. It's pretty brutal. And we've been working closely with code to change that perception. And one of the ones that we have totally accomplished is the City of Austin should choose local vendors first when they put out RFPs or they're picking a company to be a city vendor, that the local businesses, the way the scale is looked at and how the rating system goes, that local businesses should be considered first, and now that's done in Austin. So we were able to accomplish that, and we're working on the others. And then if you'll advance one, the goals from the 2014 conference were pretty interesting, and this is, I think, where some of the things cross over with ISLR, in that the first thing they asked for is they felt like local business will never be sustainable until it has the opportunity to own its property. But local business is usually small, not always, but small business needs small spaces, and there's an affordability issue and an availability issue. So the leadership circle looks at this and says, well, can we do retail condos? We have medical condos, we have office condos, we have residential condos. Why don't we have retail condos? They could be small spaces that businesses could afford. Can the city do a lease to purchase program so that ultimately the business does own their space? And looking at land trust and how we could use a land trust to help a local business purchase its property, much as a lot of land trusts are used for affordable housing. So we use an affordable housing model for quite a bit that we propose, because the parallels are the same. Job creation, it's can the city sponsor an online local employment pool where everyone who's on it has the certifications from the city that they need to do their job. We have a food handler certificate, we have child care certificates, things like that. Communication of city resources, and I think this might resonate with other cities as well too, is that there's so many departments that have information and can affect a local business, everything from economic development to transportation to all of your public utilities, street closures, highway work, all kinds of things. So they all operate in silos, and it's really difficult for a small business to keep track of all this, everything from new rules from the health department and all kinds of things. So we're looking at, can we pull together all this information through a local business filter that makes it easy for a business to access this from the city? And the sustainability programs generally have focused on, we try not to use the word rent control, but it really is, because we're looking at Austin is growing so fast that the preservation of local business is an issue. They're getting priced out of their buildings. This harkens back to the very first thing of owning their property, but it also is, can we put in cultural districts or local business districts where the businesses face no more than a 5% raise in their lease every 5 years, but the property owners are going to have to get some compensation for that. So we're looking at tax rebates and things like that. The signage stipend idea is really a fun one, because what affects most businesses, not everyone, they need a sign. So when they go in to get the permit for the sign, one of the criticisms is all the incentives that packages that go to big business. In Austin, it's more of a perception than a reality. At any given point, Austin probably has 7 to 10 incentive packages out there. Only half of them get fulfilled because the big corporations who choose to use them back out of it. It's not worth it for them. But they're millions and millions of dollars. So the perception is to a local business, City of Austin, you put roadblocks in my way, but then you roll out the red carpet for big business. And so we're looking at a signage program where you would get $1,000 from the city to help pay for your sign. If you use a local artist and get an arts grant to do it, then you get another $2,000 for that. So we're supporting the arts community here and doing some more interesting signs around town. and helping local business. I think any hand out that says we want you here, and we want to see you succeed helps a lot. Sometimes it's not the really giant things, sometimes it's the small things. So those are the types of programs that we work on here in Austin.
Thanks. Thanks, Rebecca. So we want to give you all a chance to talk about some examples from your own community. So if you can figure out how that chat box works, I hope you can. Please give examples or questions for either Stacy or Rebecca to try to address. And I'm going to start the conversation going with the question maybe for you, Stacy. So here in New Mexico, at the state level, we just passed a $50 million closing fund, because for most local elected officials, and everybody was on board, is this idea that we've got to put our best foot forward for recruitment. That seems to be gospel. And what do you say to local leaders or legislators who really are sort of drinking that Kool-Aid, and they they're new, or they don't really understand, and they really are told by the business community that we have to do this. Even small business folks who are told, we need these big companies to sort of to help the economy along. What would you say to state or local leaders and folks who advocate about how to frame another way?
Right. There was a great study that was done a few years ago in the St. Louis metro region, covering the whole metro region, and it looked at the subsidies that they had given in the name of economic development. And they had given over $5 billion in subsidies over a certain number of years, and those deals had gone almost exclusively to big businesses. There were a lot of retailers that got those deals, Walmart, shopping malls. And we see this all over the country. Increasingly, Amazon warehouses are getting public funds supposedly for the economic development they bring. But this study in St. Louis looked at the impact and found that there was no net creation of jobs, basically. There were no new jobs that came out of this, and in fact, several hundred locally owned businesses had closed because of the fact that they were basically seeing their tax dollars used to subsidize their biggest competitors. This is an unfair playing field. There's a lot of great research out there that suggests that it's much smarter to put those dollars into infrastructure, into education, into the kinds of things that will lift up business overall and create broad opportunities for everyone, rather than in subsidizing particular companies. It's challenging for elected officials because they are under such pressure to show that they're doing something about the economy, and of course, if there's an empty piece of land and now there's some building on it and there are people working there and you can do a ribbon cutting, it certainly looks like you did something. But we really have to expose the reality behind that. Some of the kinds of things that I think would be useful is really to have states actually step in with some legislation that, first of all, limits the use of these subsidies for retailers. I mean, it's crazy how often we subsidize retailers, big box stores, low-wage jobs, and there's no evidence that you're doing anything but hurting existing retailers. We should step in and ban some of the worst practices, but we should also hold local governments to higher standards in terms of doing the analysis to justify that these expenditures really are going to deliver what they say they're going to deliver.
That's great. So I'm looking at the chat box here, and I'm looking for questions. So I'm encouraging folks, if you can submit any questions, we'd love to ask our speakers to kind of comment on what's going on. So we tried, I'll give another tangible example from your platform. So in Santa Fe, I worked a little bit on a public bank initiative, and this access to capital issue is very, very real. But the idea that either community development, finance, CDFIs, or other kinds of sort of community banks are really taking care of small businesses, I think that it seems to be a perception out there, and it might be true in some communities, but what I hear more often is that even the folks who are subsidized to do micro-lending, it's very, very difficult for especially a small first-time business to really get that funding. And so talk a little bit about, I know that's one of the strong areas for you, is the financial piece of this. How do we get, and certainly Rebecca, you can talk about your experience in Austin as well. How do you get not just policymakers, but financial institutions, including the nonprofit ones, to try to be more responsive to these, especially small fledgling and startups that aren't high tech per se, but maybe are they might be retail, they might be some service entity, but they really need working capital.
Yeah, it's a great question. With our research, and we've got a lot of this on our website, it's really chapter and verse on what's happened to the banking system and why it's depriving small businesses of the capital that they need. What the numbers suggest is that the problem really is consolidation in the banking industry. Community banks and small and mid-sized community banks account for only about 20% of all of the banking assets in our country at this point, but they do close to 60% of all the small business lending. With the biggest banks, the giant banks, it's sort of the reverse. They have almost 60% of the assets, but they do only about 20% of the small business lending. So as the banking sector is, increasingly consolidated into the hands of these giant institutions, it's drawing up the capital that's available locally, because it's really the local banks and credit unions that do most of that kind of lending, because they're on the ground and they can see the opportunities and they know the borrowers. Your chances of getting approved as a small business when you apply for a loan are about 3 times greater at a community bank on average than they are at big banks. So I'm dismayed that the debate in Congress is really, about the decline of community banks does not have a stronger small business voice in it, and that there isn't more concern about what's happening. And in particular, the loss of banks in low-income and minority neighborhoods that were owned locally, and thus had lending officers who understood the community, who knew the borrowers, and could make those kinds of smart lending decisions in the context of the places where they were operating. So we think that we need to really look at this issue of what's happening with community banks, and we're advocating not only federal change, but we're also looking at ways that cities and states can step in and put their support behind local banks and credit unions. One idea that a number of cities, including Trenton, Santa Fe, Oakland, are looking at now is creating a municipal partnership bank. It would basically be a city-owned bank that would back and provide partnership loans to local banks and credit unions, so they could basically expand their lending capacity because of this sort of wholesale bank that was behind them. So that's a really important strategy that we're advocating. And then the other thing I would just mention is that I've been looking at a lot of Small Business Administration lending data. So the SBA at the federal level it provides guarantees to back a lot of small business loans, tens of thousands of loans every year. Historically, it's been a really important source of credit particularly for women-owned businesses and minority-owned businesses, and also the smallest businesses. But in the last few years, for reasons that are difficult to sort of figure out, they've stopped doing so many of those small loans now. They're doing bigger dollar value loans to a few relatively big small businesses and cutting off the lending that they used to do at the small level. And so that's another thing that we're looking at. And in fact, I testified about at the Congressional Progressive Caucus this year to try to bring some change to that.
So just before, Rebecca, before I get your take on sort of this access to capital issue, but also how you sort of are helping reframe the economic development conversation in Austin, one of our participants wrote in a question about, Stacy, on your point about building alliances, where do unions fit into that? If you're in a bigger city, and he mentioned Chicago, how do you get partners in unions? The largest economic development policy we had in our last legislative session was passing right-to-work laws, and it really sucked the oxygen out of the economic development conversation. But also, ironically, our union in New Mexico, our union savings bank essentially has been one of the more progressive kind of lenders in terms of projects, but they've also invested, pension fund money in big projects as opposed to helping fund these smaller projects. So what about unions in the alliance building, and how do we work with them to say we maybe do some more progressive lending and small-scale lending?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I think it's a conversation. We need to figure out how to have a lot of those conversations at our state level between independent business groups and union leaders, and also leaders of worker justice campaigns that are outside organized labor. I think that there's a lot that's really fruitful and promising there. I think that there are a lot of misperceptions. A lot of small business owners have misperceptions about organized labor and vice versa. And so just having the conversation can often be a really eye-opening experience, I think, for both sides. In the big picture, I think historically that part of the way that Americans have controlled or limited concentrated power and ensured a more democratic economy, we've really had two strategies, through the 20th century. We had strong labor laws, and so that in industries that were by nature sort of big industries, manufacturing, national transportation systems, and so on, you could, you as a citizen, had rights within that sector by virtue of labor laws that protected your right to organize, and that's how we democratized those sectors. But then in a lot of parts of the economy, retail, media, banking, farming, areas where there isn't a big case for scale, we had laws that really protected and tried to keep the economy much more small scale and locally owned. So in a way, small business and labor rights were two progressive strategies that worked together for many years in the 20th century to create a stronger middle class and an economy that works for more people. And so I think we need to kind of resurrect that. The one last thing I'll say on that to give sort of a more specific example, last year we worked in San Francisco. We introduced two groups that we'd worked with a lot, the Jobs of Justice chapter in San Francisco, which campaigns for worker rights, and the San Francisco Locally Owned Merchants Alliance, which is a coalition of locally owned businesses. And they got to know one another and actually worked together to pass the Retail Workers' Bill of Rights in San Francisco, which gives retail workers better rights over their scheduling. Like, it protects them from a lot of the nasty things that these big chains do now around scheduling. And then they also work together to pass new legislation that gives, expanded legislation that gives neighborhoods more control to prevent new chain stores from opening. So really a pro-local business policy as well. And they discovered that they have a lot in common. Rising real estate costs are a huge issue both for workers and for small business owners in that city. And so I think having that conversation can yield a lot of really interesting outcomes.
So Rebecca, I just wanted to give you, before we talk about how we sort of can work in a more coordinated way to advance some of these policies across the country, we also had a question from someone from Elgin, from Sue Beckwith near Austin, around funding food incubators and policy around incubators to help get them off the ground. And I know we're struggling with that here, but so maybe you want to talk a little bit about how you're supporting those kinds of incubators, especially in the the non-high-tech sector. It's harder to make the case sometimes for food and farming, at least out here and some other places. But also, any other thoughts you have before we talk about how we tie this together from a national strategy perspective on policy? So, Rebecca, I'll give you just a couple of minutes to kind of respond.
Sure. Well, I think a lot of this goes back to shifting the direction of focus in economic development departments from big business to local business. So much of the effort, a shocking amount of the effort, resources that the city has are spent on recruitment. And in Austin, we're lucky in a lot of ways, but one is that businesses are moving here like crazy. We don't really need to recruit them. They're coming here anyway. Our problem is massive growth. We get 50,000 new people a year coming here. So the issue for me is, in the past, I think for a long time, small business, and I really want to make the point that local is not necessarily small and small is not necessarily local, but there's a huge correlation between the two, was pushed to the side with a pat on the head. It was, yes, you little businesses, you go over here and we'll do some little fun things for you, and then we're going to really focus on economic development, which meant bringing big businesses to Austin. I think shifting the focus of that conversation to say, wait a minute, these local businesses are the businesses that built this city. We've determined that there are between 50 and 60,000 local businesses in Austin. That packs an economic wallop that's just enormous that you can't ignore. And if you can, for us, a lot of it was starting with city council and then working down through staff and shifting that focus. In terms of the banking industry, 4 years ago, I went to do a bank local campaign to educate the public about, pay attention to where you put your money and put it in places that support the local business community with loans and services for them. When I started talking about it, we had 6 local banks. I got distracted and got back to it almost a year later. A year later, we had 1 local bank. They had all been sold. We're fortunate to have 30 credit unions in Austin, so they do a really good job with local business. And I will say our city has a small business program that is pretty amazing in a lot of ways, and one of the things that they do is a family business loan program. These are designed to people who have difficulty getting loans elsewhere. And I think right now the interest rate that they're charging on those is like 1.5%. So it's an amazing deal. We also have 5 community lenders who work with businesses who traditional banks may turn away. So locally, I feel like we have a pretty healthy mix. It doesn't guarantee everyone a loan, but there are other options other than the big banks. And in terms of farming, quite frankly, we haven't done a whole lot on that front. We have a extremely healthy farmers market system. We have a lot of local farms. We have a lot of urban farms. And the way that we get involved is helping the cities now trying to figure out what to do with these urban farms. They don't really fit in their commercial structure. They don't fit in the residential structure. So sometimes there are rubs with city policies and code and things like that. So that's primarily where our focus is, to help incorporate those urban farms into the way we live.
Well, great. So we have about 5 minutes to wrap up. I'm going to give each of you a chance to just kind of closing in kind of wrapping things up. How do we take this from being sort of a local effort that's sort of fairly disconnected to being sort of a national policy agenda, whether it's as you alluded to, Stacy, connecting local officials and local governments to pass pieces of this, but in a coordinated way, and also at the state legislative level. How do we make this more of a movement so it's not, these sort of bright spots here and there, but really not a coordinated national agenda? So I'd love to hear from both of you in wrapping up how we might be able to do that. Maybe Stacy, you can start, and Rebecca, you can close this out.
Yeah, I think that's the very question that we're wrestling with. I think there's a lot going on, but it's not connected into, people don't see it as an overall strategy or movement of policy reform effort. So part of what we want to do with releasing this platform is to try to name it and give some grounding to what this is as a whole, and to link these things together as a coherent strategy, because they really are. And then I think we want to work with all of the groups that are part of this local First Policy Committee, and then broaden the circle out to bring people in to help. How do we to look at how we share those things out in our own communities and elevate the visibility of this by doing articles, working with media, lifting up things that are happening in multiple parts of the country and showing them as really some change that's happening on a particular front. But that's going to take all of us, I think, coming together and really prioritizing and aligning around this agenda.
Well, thanks. Rebecca, any last thoughts? We have just a couple of minutes, and before I turn it back over to Leslie, any quick last thoughts?
Just that I think one resource might be the local business alliances. When, like I said, we're the second one in the nation, but I believe there are almost 140 across the country right now. A lot of them are very young. They're getting started. They're still working on benefits for their members, and they haven't been able to muster the resources to embrace this kind of advocacy and policy changes, but collectively, they represent hundreds of thousands, maybe 1 million businesses across the country. When that matures enough to coalesce in every independent business alliance doing what AIBA does locally, it makes a much stronger platform for the national agenda.
Thank you both, and thanks to everybody who listened in. I want to turn it back over to Leslie Lindo to sort of wrap up for us, and thank everybody.
Thank you.
Great, thank you, Eric, and thank you so much, Stacy and Rebecca. What a great conversation, lots of really tangible work that you're doing on the ground that I think are actions that people can take back into their community. So really appreciate the learning that came out of the discussion today. And we want to thank also all the participants for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed this topic. We'll be sending you a link to the video recording for this webinar. And you can also explore more resources in our Localist Policies Toolkit, which can be found on our website at bealocalist.org under Tools and Resources.